When you've been on the air for as long as The Simpsons, you're bound to have a few strange coincidences that line up with real-world events. But some of the beloved show's gags have predicted far-off events in such a specific way that you have to wonder if there isn't a genuine psychic or two on the writing staff. From fads and discoveries to world-changing events, here are 10 times The Simpsons predicted the future. The 20th installment of the show's annual Halloween episode, Treehouse of Horror, aired in 1998. The short opening segment featured Homer trying to use a voting machine to vote for Barack Obama in the 2008 presidential election. But the machine has other ideas. It keeps changing Homer's vote to John McCain, causing an increasingly panicked Homer to attempt to flee to alert President McCain to the malfunction. Of course, this caused many fans to scratch their heads just 4 years later, when problems with voting machines were reported across the country during the 2012 election. While a number of machines were indeed discovered to be changing votes for President Obama into votes for his Republican opponent Mitt Romney, some were actually found to be doing the opposite. The controversy over unreliable voting machines carried over into the 2016 presidential election as well, and is likely to continue for some time. At least nobody has been sucked into a voting machine and mangled to death, as happened to Homer at the end of the Treehouse of Horror segment, that we know of, so far. The fourth episode of Season 2 introduced Blinky the Three-Eyed Fish, a recurring gag throughout the series' entire history. The mutant fish is the result of contamination from Mr. Burns' nuclear power plant, and it seems to show up every time a newspaper headline about radioactive waste or contamination is required. Unbelievably, this turned out to be not so much a silly gag as a dead-on prediction that took 21 years to realize. In 2011, in Cordoba, Argentina, fishermen came up with a bona fide three-eyed fish while fishing in a reservoir near a nuclear power plant. It may not have Blinky's perfect row of 3 eyes. The fishermen said they didn't even notice the defect at first due to the darkness, but it seems that radioactive contamination just might actually cause the kind of comical mutations that nobody but The Simpsons could have predicted. In the classic Season 10 episode, The Wizard of Evergreen Terrace, Homer is inspired by Thomas Edison to become an inventor, coming up with genius ideas like the makeup shotgun and an electric hammer. These don't go over very well, but he's encouraged when one of his inventions, a chair with extra hinged legs on the back that won't tip over backward, is actually praised by his family. But it turns out that Edison invented it first, causing Homer and Bart to break into the Edison Museum with Homer's electric hammer for a little chair smashing. Of course, Homer decides not to go through with it, and ends up accidentally giving Edison credit for the electric hammer as well. This 1998 episode makes a surprising reference to an event that would rock the world of science 14 years later. In one scene, Homer can be seen writing on a chalkboard that has an elaborate equation written on it. In his book, The Simpsons and Their Mathematical Secrets, Dr. Simon Singh writes that this equation is just a tiny bit off from describing the famous Higgs boson particle, discovered in 2012. Dr. Singh writes that the math background of many of the show's writers is obvious in many of these kinds of references throughout its history. Season 5 Springfield, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Legalized Gambling, juggled multiple plot lines in its overall plot about the introduction of a casino to Springfield. Homer gets a job as a blackjack dealer, Bart starts his own casino for kids, and Lisa struggles to complete a costume for a school pageant without the help of Marge, who develops a serious problem with the slot machines in record time. The event predicted by this 1993 episode was an utter shock to the world of entertainment, and fans were quick to point out the morbid coincidence. In the show, a tiger-taming duo named Gunter and Ernst are attacked and mauled by one of their white tigers. This was an obvious reference to entertainers Siegfried and Roy, who in 2003 lost control of one of their white tigers during a performance. The big cat dragged Roy Horn by the neck, resulting in a near-fatal injury that required months of hospitalization. Fortunately, he made a complete recovery and returned to show business before retiring in 2010. Lisa's Wedding is an episode that actually tries to envision what life would be like in the future, and it got a couple things surprisingly right. The episode aired in 1995, when the internet was still coming into popular use. More people still had pagers than cell phones, and some of the technology used by the future Simpsons must have looked downright crazy. Set in the year 2010, the episode shows Lisa and Marge chatting on a video phone. While the device simply looks like a monitor attached to a rotary phone, you've got to give them credit for predicting the merging of phones with video applications. And you might want to throw in Skype and FaceTime as well. Later in the episode, Lisa's future boyfriend is seen having a conversation using his watch, which of course is possible today for many smartwatch users. Finally, during a scene in a dorm room, a device is seen lying on the ground which could almost be some kind of tablet computer. While they certainly didn't nail all of the details, The Simpsons writers' guesses about everyday technology in 2010 wasn't all that far off either. The Simpsons began its habit of casually foretelling future events early in its run. In the 9th episode of Season 2, Itchy and Scratchy and Marge, the show takes a satirical jab at its early critics by having Marge become a crusader for censorship. After seeing her kids copying violent behavior seen on the Itchy and Scratchy show, Marge forms a citizens organization called Springfieldians for Nonviolence, Understanding and Helping, or SNU for short. While she succeeds in getting all of the violence removed from Itchy and Scratchy, she decides things have gone too far when members of her group urge her to boycott a touring exhibition of Michelangelo's David, believing it to be obscene. Believe it or not, this ridiculous scenario played out in real life when Russian voters were asked whether or not to clothe a replica of the famous statue in St. Petersburg. It was argued that the exhibition would be seen by schoolchildren and could be seen as inappropriate. Unbelievably, this is one time that truth turned out to be even stranger than fiction. In Springfield, Marge, believing the David sculpture to be a masterpiece, conceded that it's wrong to censor one form of art but not another, and Itchy and Scratchy got their violence back. In St. Petersburg, the vote to clothe the statue passed. The Season 6 episode Lisa on Ice sees Lisa and Bart getting into a ferocious competition as members of competing hockey teams. It turns out that Lisa is a natural at goaltending, and she helps lead Apu's Quickie-Mart squad to their best season. But in the climactic game against Bart's team, it all comes down to Bart versus Lisa, when Bart gets a penalty shot as time expires in the tied game. The episode ends on a heartwarming note, as the brother and sister remember all their good times growing up together, lay down their equipment and hug, ending the game in a tie. Of course, this being Springfield, the spectators promptly begin rioting. If you blink, you might miss the clever reference to the future in this episode. Nelson has an Apple Newton, a then-new PDA that featured handwriting to text recognition. When Nelson takes a note to remind himself to beat up Martin, the Newton mistranslates the note as "eat up Martha." Anybody who has ever used Siri can relate, but this episode aired in 1994, 17 years before Siri's debut. In the episode Bart Carney, Homer and Bart end up as carnival workers after a mishap involving Bart and some property damage. When Homer gets a fixed gaming operation shut down by failing to properly bribe Chief Wiggum, the Simpsons invite a Carney family to stay with them and get tricked out of their home. The episode aired in 1998, and the carnival sequence seemed to predict a gaming fad that seemed ridiculous enough at the time to qualify as a sight gag. A bunch of happy kids are seen playing on a virtual reality yard work simulator, which is a pretty accurate description of the wildly popular social network game Farmville, and others like it. It might have seemed pretty silly to think that people would waste hours tending to virtual crops in 1998, but by 2011 you were being invited to do just that by seemingly everybody on your friends list. The Simpsons' 4th season produced many classic episodes, but perhaps none with so hilarious a premise as its 20th episode, Whacking Day. It involves Lisa and Bart's attempts to uncover the truth about a time-honored tradition in which all of Springfield's snakes are driven into the center of town and beaten to death with clubs. If this sounds over the top silly, it sounded more like a viable solution to Florida state wildlife officials. In 2012, the state unveiled plans for its month-long wildlife challenge, which is notably far less comically blunt than Whacking Day, but amounts to pretty much the same idea. Residents are encouraged to kill as many invasive snakes as they can, with a chance for cash prizes of up to $1,500. Officials say that the contest is less about blood sport and more about raising awareness of the harm that non-native python species can do to the environment if released into the wild. Of course, at the end of the Simpsons episode, it just turned out that the whole thing started back in the 1920s as an excuse to beat up the Irish, which thankfully doesn't appear to be the case here. Finally, the 11th season episode Bart To The Future is another future-looking episode which sees Bart being shown a vision of his future after the family makes a stop in an Indian casino. It's not a pretty sight. He ends up as a failed wannabe rock star living with Ralph Wiggum, but it doesn't turn out so bad for Lisa, who is the first female president of the United States. This March 2000 episode didn't have much to say about future technology, but it did depict an America that seemed to be going slightly crazy, and it got one thing devastatingly right, when President Lisa Simpson informs her cabinet that they have inherited quite a budget crunch from President Trump. The episode, of course, received quite a bit of renewed attention after the 2016 election, 17 years after it first aired.